Thank you all for coming. Welcome to lunch at the library here at Bennett Martin Public Library in Lincoln, Nebraska. My name is Deb Arns. I'm the curator of the Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors here on the third floor of Bennett Martin. And I'd like to take this time to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, whose support makes this series possible, and also for their support of the Heritage Room's efforts to preserve and share Nebraska's literary heritage. This is where I make announcements of upcoming events, but we're actually taking a break in January, so there will be no lunch at the library, and we'll start again in February. And if you would like to find out about the spring speakers, please check the Lincoln City Library website. That information will be posted soon. So today right now I'll be announcing today's speaker. So our speaker today is Max Perry Mueller. His latest book is Wakara's America, The Life and Legacy of a Native Founder of the American West. The book explores the forgotten life and complex legacies of Wakara, the mighty, once notorious Native leader whose battles and conquests shaped the American West, and who was among the most influential and feared men in the 19th century, famed as a fierce warrior, a merciless trader of Indian slaves, and history's greatest horse thief. Max is an associate professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and is the author of the award-winning Race and the Making of the Mormon People. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Republic, and Slate, and he lives here in Lincoln. So please welcome Max.
Thank you. Let's see. All right, I hope I don't cause trouble there. So thank you all for coming. You know, it's a small, mighty crowd. I've actually had, as I said before, smaller crowds. It's either boom or bust sometimes with these type of events, but I really appreciate you all making it out today on a particularly, we've had weather the last few days. Maybe that's what's keeping folks at home. But hey, greetings to the folks at home in the future. Again, thanks for coming today. I'm in between classes. Had a class in the morning and class in the afternoon, just walking down the street. So, and this is one of our home libraries for my children. I have a 7 and 11-year-old, and boy, the libraries. Of course, all public libraries are wonderful, but we are so grateful to live in a town, in a city where the libraries are beloved and supported, and support the work that authors and scholars like I am, the work we do. So thanks for this invitation. So I want to tell you about Wakara, because not a lot of folks know about him. And I think you should. That's kind of one of the main arguments about this book. So who was Wakara? And so I'm going to answer kind of 3 questions. Who was Wakara? Why don't we know about him? And why should we? And then I'm going to do a brief reading. And then I'll talk about the structure of the book, some of the arguments in the book, and then I'll pause and then really would love to hear any questions for folks, hopefully stimulate some discussions. And I'll just plug here that the book makes a great Christmas gift or holiday gift, Hanukkah, etc. gift on sale after the chat here and at various local bookstores. And yes, of course, support your independent local bookstores, especially this time of year. This is kind of skews this gender specific, but it makes a great dad book, right? You got Adventures of the West, you got horse thieves, you got slavery, you got war, you got fishing, right? A great dad book or dad-like folk. So who was Wakara? So Wakara, as the introduction kind of outlined, was the most feared, was the greatest horse thief in the 1840s. Known around the country as the greatest horse thief in his time. And so he was from Utah, and I was saying before, I love skiing. My true religion is skiing. So I go to Utah to ski, and the archives always go bad if you don't visit them, right? They spoil if you don't visit them in February and March when the skiing is at its height. So, but he was from Utah. In fact, he was from Provo area of Utah, Salt Lake City, folks know, and then just south is actually where Provo is, where BYU is, and it's actually home to the third largest body of fresh water west of the Mississippi, what is now called Utah Lake. And Wakera's people were from that region, and I'll talk about why that's so important in terms of their relationship to fish a little bit later. But that was his home base. And in the 1840s, he became, as I said, the greatest horse thief of the American West. He would travel from central Utah south along what was called the Old Spanish Trail, the most important overland route that connected northern Mexico, New Mexico now, the outposts in Santa Fe, Taos, and Abiquiu in particular, along the Old Spanish Trail that went through Utah, cutting across Nevada, over the mountains into California. And he would head to California, and he would steal horses by the hundreds and thousands from the California ranchos. The ranchos were the secularized missions that Juan Posera started in the 1770s. And he would spend a couple of months there with his lieutenants and other cavalrymen and other mountain men, stealing horses a little bit at a time, and then running a couple of dozen at a time each raid, and running them into the canyons and mountain passes that he knew very well until they had enough horses, and then they'd march them east along the Old Spanish Trail to sell in New Mexico. And he was, the Californios really hated his horse raiding. It was very disruptive. But it also supplied the horsepower, and I use that, mean it literally here, the horsepower that helped power the expansion of the American West in the 1840s. Along the way, he also enslaved other Native Americans. On his return, mostly on his return trip from California, he would enslave Paiutes. Now, he was a Ute, as in Utah. The state of Utah is named after his tribe. But the Paiutes, who were often, in a lot of ways, his kin, they spoke similar languages. What distinguished him from his kin were horses, and we'll talk about how that plays a really important role in his life. And he would enslave them on the way back from California during the early spring season, when the Paiutes, who lived really hand to mouth, were at their most vulnerable. And he would sell the enslaved Paiutes in New Mexico and California, again providing the human power, right, that powered the settler American West. So he was well known and feared in the 1840s as this horse raider and trader and slaver. He was also a cartographer, a really important cartographer. In the 1840s, as the West was really becoming part of America, recall in 1848, so when the Mexican-American War annexed huge parts of western U.S., Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, right? That all became part of America, and America had finally reached its goal of kind of having almost total domination over the continental U.S. And Wakera actually helped allow that to happen, because he softened up California, making it easier for the U.S. Army to march in there against the Mexicans. But all the explorers were coming through. Most famously, John C. Fremont was coming through on his many expeditions and mapping the American West. And Wakera met Fremont and other explorers, and Wakera would tell them, the explorers, where the best mountain passes were, where the best watering holes. He knew that he was the most well-traveled man in the Southwest at the time. And his descriptions of those passes were written down into journals and brought back east when the explorers reached Washington and made into the maps, the very maps that other settlers used in later parts of the 1840s and the 1850s, used to to move west. And one of the biggest groups that came west were the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And we'll talk a little bit more about his relationship to the Mormons. So he was the greatest horse thief of the time, the greatest slaver, a really important cartographer. He also expanded the Old Spanish Trail, which was the most important trade route of the 1840s. So, he really was, as I argue in the book, a founding figure of the American West, and his founding will continue when the Latter-day Saints arrive in Utah and his relationships. But why don't we know him, right? So who was he, right? I hope I've made that argument that he's a really important figure and also well-known, a living legend during his time, right? All the newspaper reports about the conquest of the West would write about his exploits, right? He was a key figure in the consumption of Easterners love to learn about the exploration of the West. So he was a key figure in that exploration, and his reports were consumed by Easterners in newspapers and in journals like John C. Fremont's that became bestsellers. So he was a living legend during his lifetime, so why don't we know him? Well, because he's a Native American. And a key part of America's origin story, right, manifest destiny, how America becomes America, is the removal of Native peoples from the land, right, and from the history books. So he doesn't fit comfortably into our stories about how America came to be. And I argue in the book he was purposely forgotten, and I outline the ways in which he was forgotten and on purpose. He's this really interesting figure as one of my main mentors and partners in this work, and I work very closely with the various tribes of Utah, including his direct descendants. But one of my best partners in this work is actually folks from the Paiute tribes, the folks that Wakera enslaved. And Rena Pickavit is an elder associated with the Kanash band of Paiutes. And in our work in discussing Wakera and his legacy, she has said this: he was a great man, not necessarily a good one, right? And one of the parts I'm trying to do in this book is recover his humanity, right? He acted like any leader, many leaders, many founders do, right? With very kind of, from our perspective today, kind of mixed, some things that are admirable we look back, and some things that we look back with and question their morality, efficacy. But so he's a human figure. And that means also he doesn't fit comfortably in this idea of a Native American. He's not this, and though he was written about in both of these ways, not this kind of horrible threat to the colonies, right? This kind of savage that we have to best and kill, right? Sometimes he was written about that, but that's not actually how he was. That's the stereotype. The other stereotype is the noble Native American whose loss, is a benighted Native American of yesteryear, whose loss kind of speaks to a loss of America's innocence in the creation of the American West. So he doesn't fit comfortably into these narratives. So I argue he was purposely forgotten. And so that's why we don't know about him. But I think we should know about him in a lot of ways, because it helps, knowing Wakera's story helps us understand Native people's place in the creation of America. Wakera, I argue, is quite unique, but in the size of his exploits, and that's the way he was unique in the size of his exploits, but not necessarily different in kind from a lot of Native Americans who have participated in creating America and continue to participate in the creation of America and do so as Americans and proud Americans. And that's one of the ways I frame the book, and working directly with his direct descendants, tribal descendants, and otherwise. And I would argue that as settler America, and I kind of distinguish between settler descendants like myself, people who came from elsewhere, immigrants who in a lot of ways like myself, and I trace this in the book, my place in America, many of our places in America, was built on stolen, and our wealth, as much as it may be, built on stolen Native land and spilt Native blood. And what does it mean to know about that history, our own history, in relation to a figure like Wakera and others today? And how can we do better in the present? Another one of my favorite interlocutors and mentors is the spiritual leader of the Ute tribe, Larry Sespuch. And he says, not only are our ancestors always with us, we are our ancestors, right? We are embodied representations of our ancestors. And today we get to make choices different than our ancestors did in the past. So I really try to encourage folks who read the book and speak to folks like myself who have those backgrounds. What would it mean to have a more moral, more just relationship with our fellow citizens, fellow Native American citizens to this day, including what does it mean to own the land we own, right? But I'll say that a little bit towards the end of my talk here. So what I'm going to do now is read a portion of the book, and one of the way I frame the book, the way I start the book, is actually at Wakera's gravesite. And that gravesite is really critical, a space where Wakera attempted to preserve his own Native American, his own Ute way of being in relationship to the land and to the land which he eventually would himself call America. And in what happens to that grave is a story of erasure, purposeful erasure of Wakera's place in America and Wakera's history in America. So I'll start at that gravesite. Kanosh stared down into the empty graves. Kanosh is another Ute leader. Kanosh stared down into the empty graves. Gone from the tombs constructed out of huge sandstone slabs were the bodies of Kanosh's son and brother. Gone, too, were the remains of Kanosh's fellow Ute leader, the most famous and feared Native American in the early American West, Wakera, often anglicized as Walker. The date was August 16th, 1874, late summer in the Utah Territory, and nearly 20 years since Wakera's death and burial. Anger and sorrow welled up in Kanosh's chest as he stood on a 7,000-foot high ledge in the Pavant Mountains. Sun beat down on Kanosh's crease-lined face. The head of the Pavant band of Utes, Kanosh untied the handkerchief wrapped around his neck. He wiped away tears and sweat that collected in his large white mustache. Earlier that day, Kanosh, along with 2 of his Pavant lieutenants and 2 Mormon settlers, had saddled their horses. They rode up a zigzagging mountain path canopied by Gamble oaks. Their destination was a 50-acre field of sandstone above Kanosh's farm and homestead. Today, whites call the field the Cow. From a distance, the field resembles a mooing cow. Local Native Americans, however, have long called it Walker's Mountain, home to a massive Ute burial ground of more than 100 graves. It was a Sunday morning, normally a time Kanosh and his fellow Mormons devoted to church. The Ute leader had been baptized into the faith years before. Still, Kanosh and his party spent the Sabbath making their arduous journey up Walker's Mountain to investigate reports that outsiders had recently been to the Ute cemetery and with nefarious intentions. What Kanosh found left the Ute leader livid. Quote, "The body of Shot, Kanosh's brother, and Stambo, Kanosh's son, are entirely gone, stolen," reported Kanosh's longtime friend and local Mormon leader Reuben McBride in a letter back to his superiors in Salt Lake City, the capital of the Utah Territory and the central stake of the Mormon Kingdom. McBride, a 71-year-old convert from upstate New York who helped establish the first Mormon settlements on Kanosh's ancestral land, had never seen the Ute leader so upset. Before that day, many thought Kanosh had done well for himself by throwing his lot in with the Mormons. Ever since the Mormons fled to the Intermountain West in 1847 to escape religious persecution, Kanosh had acted as a peacemaker between the settlers and the Utah Native peoples, whose land they colonized. Kanosh cut his hair in the Mormon style. He became a private landowner and farmer, and Kanosh was married to several Native wives at a time. Still, many Utah natives were wary of the Mormons' colonization and their way of life. This was especially true of Kanosh's fellow Utes, who, before the Mormons' arrival, had been the region's most formidable tribe. To the Mormons, Kanosh appeared the rarest of thing, a native who had become civilized. But according to another local Mormon, the grave robbing brought out the true Indian in him. Quote, "I am satisfied, had we not held a controlling influence over Kanosh and his men, the war whoop and the scalping knife would have been heard and used in our defenseless towns as a result of this dastardly act." Kanosh's loss on Walker's Mountain were painful. But the grave robbers had not been hunting Kanosh's relatives. They were after Wakera, the legendary horse thief, trader of Indian slaves, cavalry leader and defender of Native sovereignty, who had died suddenly in January 1855 and was buried in a massive tomb next to Kanash's family plots. The grave robbers had been successful. The once sacred burying ground of the great chief Wakera, wrote McBride, had been desecrated. Before it was robbed, Wakera's grave had contained the bodies of the Ute leader and several other natives who had been killed to join Wakera in the happy hunting grounds beyond the Veil. But in August 1874, McBride reported that he and the visiting party had found but fragments remaining of the should-be quiet sleepers. I'm going to jump here a little bit to get to the description of just the burial site and what happened right after Wakera died. So on January 29th, 1855, 6 months after the conclusion of what locals had called the Walker War, and called that by the rest of most of the rest of America, Wakera died suddenly. His burial ceremony reminded some settler observers of the funerals of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Befitting his stature as the king of the mountains, Wakera's followers killed a dozen of his favorite horses, which they laid in a circle around his grave. They also slit the throats of 2 women, often described as Walker's wives, and 2 children, often described as Paiute slaves, to join Wakera in the afterlife. Inside his massive stone crypt, these members of Wakera's death party were buried next to the departed leader, along with his favorite saddle, hunting and fishing gear, guns, ammunition, and a letter of friendship from Brigham Young. Outside the tomb, an enslaved Paiute boy was buried up to his neck, so that the scavenging animals would feast on him instead of Wakera. The boy died a few days later. The local settlers who witnessed the burial firsthand in 1855, and the Americans who penned the most widely read narratives of the West's pioneering era, professed shock at the high body count of Wakera's funeral. But in truth, they were also relieved. By pointing to Wakera's quote-unquote savagery toward settlers and other natives, settlers succeeded in misdirecting attention away from their own violence in the form of disease, environmental degradation, their own trade in native slaves, and wars of extermination, which put hundreds of thousands of natives in the ground. Wakera's infamy in life did not guarantee that in death he would rest in peace. When Kanash's party visited Wakera's mountain 19 years after his passing, they found the grave robbers were, in fact, headhunters. They took the skulls and tossed aside most of the rest of the bones to become snacks for scavenging animals. Following his 1874 visit with Kanash, Reuben McBride wrote to his superiors in Salt Lake. He asked them if they had any information about the grave robbing. For McBride, Kanash, and others who visited Wakera's mountain, the question of who stole these skulls yet remained a mystery. And really the book, what follows, is kind of an unfolding of of this mystery, right? Who was Wakera? As I said before, and why was he removed from this site? Why was he literally removed, from his burial site, and how does that fit into the erasure story that I'm articulating in the book? But also, how does his life and his legacy, especially embodied in his his descendants, speak to the enduring presence of Native peoples on the land, their influence on the land, and their presence in our lives, or in American life today. So that's a little bit about the book. The book follows, and briefly, I'll just kind of describe the book, and then I'd be happy to take some questions. So I mentioned that Wakera starts life, and this is how the book unfolds. And in a lot of ways, I do move back and forth between time. Again, I do so based on the advice and the counsel of Native and Indigenous scholars who who themselves don't think in time as linear, right? That's another very settler idea, that time moves across space, or time marches across space and time, right? Kind of in a linear fashion. Whereas Native peoples, and again I mentioned Larry Sesbuch, the spiritual leader, thinks of time as a circle, or even seasonal. And Wakera's time was one time, his erasure is another, right? The diaspora of his people, that means, the removal of his people away from their homelands. But perhaps we're in a new time right now when settlers like myself and perhaps many of you and indigenous people are recognizing a time of return, welcoming and recognizing a return of Native peoples and also Native peoples' understanding to the land back in a lot of ways, because the settler way of doing things hasn't gone so well. And that's certainly true in Utah, which is undergoing many, many problems in terms of the desertification of Utah. Speaking of desertification and the lack of water, so I start the book looking at Wakera's fish, and studying how his tribe, his band, in fact, the Timpanogos Utes, were known by other Utes and took their identity from the fish. Utah Lake was the home to the greatest fishery of the Great Basin, probably the greatest fishery in the American Southwest. Home to 13 endemic species, native species, and Wakera's Utes took their identity from those fish because they ate them. That was main part of their diet. And between the springtime and early summer, Ute bands would gather at Utah Lake for a huge fish festival, and they would harvest the spawning fish that ran out from the Utah Lake into the many tributaries. They were also great resource managers. They were managing these fisheries, right? One of the things they did, right, is they lived through trial and error, they learned to live in that place, in that environment, in that ecosystem. So they knew which fish to harvest and which fish to let go to spawn, and they did so over generations and generations. So that's the story of Wakera's fish and the importance of fish one of the first parts of the book. Part of the story is how the settlers then came in, and with their settler mindset of instead of living in relationship to an ecosystem, they extracted. So the Mormon settlers came in, and they learned to grow things in Utah, which was very different from the Northeast, where a lot of them came. They had to become fish eaters themselves. So in fact, they overfished the Utah Lake, really destroying the fishery there, and really changing that great body of water that a lot of explorers came through and imagined building huge settlements there. The next part, I look at Wakera's relationship to horses, and when the horse arrives, and how the horse reshapes kind of Wakera's and his people's territorial reach, and his relationship with other colonizers like the Spanish, the Californios, and other native peoples. But the horses, again, also affect the environment, right? One of the things I want to make sure we do in this book is that native peoples are like all other peoples. Like they learn through trial and error how to live in a place. When the horse came, they didn't know how to first live with it. In fact, they ended up over-hunting the small bison herd that was native to the area. So and the horses drastically changed the environment around central Utah because of the changes to the grasslands, the ways the requirements of horses. My point is, right, history is shifting and changing, and the environment is changing, and people are changing in relationship to the natural world in which they're a part. And I mentioned slaves. So each part of the book, it goes from Wakera's fish, Wakera's horses, and then Wakera's slaves. So as I mentioned, because the Timpanogos Utes adopted the horse, they could dominate their kin, who spoke similar languages, the Paiutes. And this is true across the history of the world. When one population of people get the horse, their next door neighbors better learn to get the horse, or they're going to be dominated, enslaved, taken over, and folded into that community. And that is certainly the case in Utah with Wakera's horses. So he uses the horses to dominate the slaves and sell the slaves on either end of the Old Spanish Trail. Here we have an entry into already. We've talked about the Latter-day Saints. The Latter-day Saints come to the area, and they are really interested in for various for theological reasons, interested in having relationships in many different kinds of ways with native peoples. And so Wakera, when the Mormons arrive, he's really happy because he's going to use the Mormons to place settlements on parts of his land, perhaps actually that is not his land. So he would direct Mormons to spots where of his rivals and say, hey, go over here and take over that land, and the Mormons would end up basically fighting his own battles for him, driving off his own rivals. But he also wanted the Mormons and placed them in spots all around Utah to become nodes of his network of horses and slaves. So, and the Latter-day Saints were really excited about Wakera because they recognized him as a really big source of power, and he was interested in partnering with them. And so for a time, he was baptized a Latter-day Saint and became an ordained elder in the church. The Mormons said, "Oh, great! He will adopt our ways, and we will be able to control him." He didn't see it that way. He saw the affiliation with the Mormons as another a way to build kin network for trade, for etc. But the Mormons were really interested in Wakera's slaves, and because they wanted to adopt them is the language they use, into their families and raise them as their own based on some of the theology of the Latter-day Saints, which required them to partner with Native Americans in building up their New World, New Jerusalem. But Wakera, as I said, didn't behave as and one of the main people I trace in this, his relationship is with Brigham Young, the great colonizer and Mormon leader at the time. And I trace in the book Wakera's relationship with Brigham Young, which is, sometimes friend, sometimes foe. And the most famous part, if anyone knows anything about Wakera in Utah, they know him for this so-called Walker War, which school children learn about what they know. Learn about Wakera. They'll learn that this great Ute leader warred against the Mormons because they tried to stop his slave trading. Well, in the book, I prove that that's almost all bunk, and bunk from the beginning. First of all, Wakera didn't participate in this skirmish between 1853 and 1854. He didn't participate barely at all. But very quickly, Brigham Young, other Mormons, and the national press began to label it Walker's War. And I trace the long history of America in naming wars after Native Americans when settlers really were the belligerents. And that starts even with, and I trace one of Brigham Young's first ancestors in America who participated in one of the first of those wars, the King Philip's War, back in Massachusetts. And that process, right, of settlers moving into an area, having often pretty productive relationships with Native peoples, eventually growing, taking over resources, the Native peoples objecting, right? Perhaps objecting by taking cattle, grain, and then the settlers saying, Indian depredations, you're attacking us, and justifying those the Native peoples taking grain and cows and horses as an act of violence. But the most really key part of the book and key part of my argument is that the settlers have a huge advantage in these conflicts. Not often they have weapons advantages, they have disease advantages, but I also have the advantage of being able to write things down. So they have the means of production of history, right? Means of production of history. They get to write down who was, a good guy, who's a bad guy, who was a savage, who's civilized, who's a Christian, who's a heathen. And so they get to write down and name the wars. And so I trace how this history of naming wars, including this war in Utah, fits into the larger history of blaming Native peoples for these conflicts. So in that part, it's called Brigham's War. This is the only part of the book that's, not Wakera's something, but Brigham's War. And the last part, I end with his skull, and the Wakera skull, and the history of this very interesting, very troubling history of science and as a frontier in really one of the last frontiers of colonizing and removing Native peoples from the land, which was after the Civil War. Not only were after the Civil War, the Union armies sent west to fight the so-called Indian Wars, killing off Indian peoples from the land, but also collecting Indian skulls, which they brought back to Washington for study. The idea, the larger the crania volume, the smarter, the larger the intellect. Lo and behold, Native peoples had smaller crania, which means they couldn't hold civilization in their heads and participate in civilization, and were therefore the U.S. government was justified in not including them in politics, in citizenship, and justified in removing them from American lands and isolating them on reservations. Of course, this is all bunk science, right? There's no causation between the size of one's crania volume and one's intelligence. But one last bit that I'll tease is how Wa Kera died, right? There's some evidence that Wa Kera did not die of natural causes. And I trace some of that ways. Perhaps he was poisoned, and as part of that Walker War that I discussed, and there's some pretty good evidence for that. Brigham Young understanding that Wa Kera really would be the person standing in his way of dominating the American West. I'll just say again one last thing about kind of return and this long season of diaspora, perhaps return. So many people have heard of NAGPRA, which are the set of laws that require mostly the universities, state governments, state museums, and most importantly, the Smithsonian, to take an inventory of their Native American holdings and begin the process of returning to the Native American tribes. And Wa Kera's skulls all the skulls associated with him are at the Smithsonian and have actually been studied. It's a very complicated process because of the complications around his large burial party, his death party. But the technical word, the legal word for this process is called does anyone know? Repatriation. Now, repatriation is a legal process coming out of actually war history, right? So POWs killed in war, their remains are returned, the idea of repatriation, are returned to their homes so they can be buried, right? And this is a process. I'm very proud of my colleagues in the Global Studies department who are actually in Germany right now finding some remains of American POWs and returning them. Well, repatriation, NAGPRA and all the laws associated did not involve any Native consultation at all. They were designed to solve a settler state problem. They were designed by the settler state, right, the American government, to solve a settler state problem, right? So repatriation really doesn't work, especially if the land from which those remains were stolen is still isn't on the homelands of the people. You can't return Wa Kera's remains to his homeland, because it's controlled by the combatant, the U.S. government, right? The belligerent, the other party. So the process that Native people argue for is a different process. It's called rematriation, right? Rematriation, remove the settlers from the process entirely, especially the settler state, and is more about reestablishing a sacred spiritual relationship between the people and their land. And really this comes out of the matriarch, the seed carriers, right? Indigenous women who collect seeds and pass on seeds to their descendants and plant the seeds, right? Creating relationship between people and the land, and people and the land together. But this process, I think, is a new way of thinking about how we also can imagine our participation in these acts of rematriation. And what would that mean? Including considering, as I ask us all to do, right? Many of us own land, And here we are in Lincoln, Nebraska. We actually can find the people, probably even the families whose lands our homes sit on, right? My colleague, Margaret Jacobs, the director of the Great Plains Studies, is working with the Oto Missouri folks and having them return. That's an act of rematriation. We have Oto Missouri Day every September. Boy, should we own this land, right? What would it mean to consider? What does it mean that we pass on that land, as I probably will do with my children, pass on that land that we've accumulated, that wealth that we've accumulated in this land to the next generation? We know better now where that land comes from. If not that land, right, our personal holdings, what about the universities? What about our churches? What about our state governments? What would it mean to start considering returning land isn't the right word because that's an active act of the settlers, but working together with Native peoples to realize that land back, and that's the movement out of which this comes, this idea of land back. What would it mean to cede ownership of that land and not see it necessarily as giving something up, but working in partnership with indigenous peoples, especially since indigenous people, some have proven to be better stewards to the land, right? So I want us to consider that really hard idea. And I do so not to make us feel bad. I always it's not self-flagellating, right, when we consider this past, but an active way of reimagining our relationship to the land, one in which settlers can become indigenous themselves. Robin Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, has a great section, a very generous section, about how to become indigenous. Not to become native, because that's a historical, political, even a question of citizenship, but how can we become indigenous? And I argue, at least even considering these ideas about what it means to hold this land and pass it on just to our own children, how we could become indigenous and entering into relationship with our fellow Native American citizens. So I'll end there. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
So I knew that there were Native Americans who were enslaved, but it sounds like he had a large business going, basically.
Yes.
So who did he sell these people to, and is there an approximation of numbers?
Yes, terrific question. Yes. So he wasn't alone in this, right? Slavery has existed various forms, and I actually discuss slavery is really not the right word. It's a different kind of bondage. His type of bondage was really about making kin networks. It was brutal sometimes, absolutely, but anyway, I differentiate between his version of slavery and settlers' slavery. But yes, he sold enslaved peoples to the Californios, to the New Mexicans, to the Mormons when they came. I mentioned that he was baptized. Here, I'll make this point very briefly. I mentioned he was baptized and ordained into the Mormon priesthood, and the Mormon priesthood is a lay priesthood. It's belongs to all male members. There's a big race history in that, because only in 1978 were black men allowed to, men of African descent allowed to hold the priesthood. That's from my first book, that story. But Wakera placed his own children, his own daughters, in the homes of one of the settlements he helped found, called Manti, which is he's really a founder of many of these settlements. When I say he's a founder of the American West, I mean literally he's a founder of the American West. He helped found a bunch of these settlements, partnering with the Latter-day Saints. And he even placed his own daughters in the Mormon homes, and they became polygamous wives of Mormon leaders, and they have their own huge set of descendants. There are lots of Latter-day Saints walking around Utah and in the Utah or the Mormon diaspora who don't even know they're descendants of Wakera. And Wakera expected children back. He wanted the settlers to place children in his family, right? Well, a form of bondage, right? But this is what kings and queens and people have done, you give me one of, I'll take, your son will marry my daughter, et cetera, I'll marry yours, et cetera, to build kin networks. So that's kind of a form of bondage. But so yes, I mean, Indian slavery has long existed before settlers arrived and long after. It lasts longer than kind of African chattel bondages in the South. And I'm building off the work of Andres Resnez, who was gracious enough to blurb the book, and his great book, The Other Slavery, which is the most comprehensive history of Indian slavery, and the huge import. And to answer your questions, millions and millions of indigenous people were enslaved. Millions. I probably should be able to, probably 100 people, not named necessarily, but that I can see just in the records that went in and out of his hands, just Wakera's. And mostly mostly the slaves were women and girls.
Was it forced marriage or was it
Yeah.
like a money transfer?
Both, all of those things. So yes, so one of the ways that the settlers removed native peoples from the land, they used war to remove men from the land and slavery to remove women from the land, and placing, and yes, and the Latter-day Saints have a rich, complicated theology around Native American people on those issues. But so yes, lots of folks involved, Indian involved. Yeah. Yes, sir. Did you have a question?
Yeah, but I'm gonna have to
Okay,
go.
yeah,
I'll have
yes,
to buy
I-
the book.
okay,
to
great.
Find my answer.
Okay, great. Yes.
How did you find out about Wakara and decide to write about him?
Yeah, very briefly, my first book, Race and the Making of Mormon People, University of North Carolina Press, 2017. This book was published by Basic Books just in November. So for my dissertation, I wrote my first book, out of which my dissertation came. I was really interested in questions of race and Mormonism, race writ large. How did the early Latter-day Saints construct race? And Wakera was a key part of that book. When the Mormons got to Utah, he was the most powerful man in Utah. They got to Utah using the maps that he helped design with John C. Fremont. He partnered with them, warred with them, et cetera, et cetera. But how they wrote about him, right, what I call the paper Indian, was how they framed, a lot of the ways that they worked out their understanding of what it meant to be a Native American, they did so through Wakera, writing about Wakera. And they had so much correspondence, rich correspondence, that I drew from. So I realized, man, this guy is so amazing. The purpose of this book is to kind of turn the gaze around, turn the focus around, and tell a story from his point of view. So that's how I got to know him. Yeah, and he's really, you start, like anything, you start looking for it, you find it everywhere. But the hardest part was easy to find him Walker in the Anglo language, but his names are different. In California, he had a different name. In New Mexico, he had a different name. So finding him in the archives was quite difficult because his name, we actually don't know how to say his name. Wakera, Wakaruru is probably how you say it in the northern Ute dialect, but yes. Yes, do you have another question?
Yeah, right. Was human sacrifice a common thing among the Utes, or was this a special circumstance?
It was not rare. So Wakera, the same time he was placing his own children in Mormon homes and being baptized, there was a huge measles outbreak. And one of the ways they tried to stave it off was kill Paiutes, right? Sacrifice Paiutes. When he sacrifices Paiutes when he gets real sick. I don't tell this story in the book, but he gets sick really all of a sudden in January. And there's some evidence that maybe he got sick for some poison tobacco. The Mormons used part of their war was poisoning things like wells and meat, and it was a total war. They used strychnine and arsenic, and Brigham sends them one letter that is suggests that Brigham sends them a letter that suggests that and during the so-called Walker War, Brigham sends him a letter and says, hey, why are you fighting against your best friends? Again, Walker really didn't have much to do with it. You know, you're fighting against your best friends. Why would you ever do this? I'm sending you some tobacco so you'll feel better. And they were always smoking tobacco together. It's like it's part of kin building and trade building among Native peoples. But if, in the letter, but if you don't trust the tobacco, have one of your prisoners smoke it and you'll know it's good. So suggesting that the tobacco was poisoned. So he goes north very suddenly, and I'm trying to, from where his home was, in Parowan in southern Utah, along the old Spanish Trail. And I'm kind of guessing he's trying to get home to that lake I described, Utah Lake. But he's going north much earlier than he would normally, and I think he's trying to get home because he's rushing, he's sick. But yeah, he sacrifices Paiutes along the way, hoping that it'll stave off the sickness. And it's shocking, right, for us today, and we have to take that into consideration. But again, his goal was to preserve his way of life and his relationship to the land, right? And lots of founders have sacrificed people, explicitly or not, right? Killed people, explicitly or not, as part of their work. So, great. I have to run to class. So thank you, future viewers.